Kerry McLoughlin believed it was just another day on the river. To him, the river was familiar, almost comforting. But what he saw as a place of peace, its true inhabitants saw as territory. And that day, the river reminded him who it belonged to. Kerry walked in alive, confident, rod in hand. He didn't walk back out. His final moments were claimed by the jaws of a predator. Here is the painful story of Kerry McLoughlin. The sun rose with a strange reluctance over Kakadu National Park, its light seeping through a shroud of mist that clung to the East Alligator River like a whispered secret. The dawn wasn't vibrant. It was pale, almost ghostly, casting hesitant gold across the river's glassy surface. The river, wide and deceptively still, held its breath, concealing the currents and creatures that stirred beneath. It was a liar, this river, promising calm while hiding hunger. Cahill's Crossing stretched across its deceptive expanse, a narrow ribbon of concrete and gravel, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, flanked by dense jungle and red dust. Infamous among locals and whispered about in travel guides, it was a place where fate was tempted daily. Saltwater crocodiles didn't lurk here in ambush. They waited with the patience of centuries. Signs warned of their presence, stark and unambiguous, yet tourists came, drawn by the thrill of danger or the allure of the wild. Locals, too, crossed it, their respect for the river tempered by familiarity. Everyone knew the risk. Some rolled the dice anyway. On the morning of March 17, 1987, the air was thick with humidity, a suffocating weight that pressed against the skin. The road to the crossing glistened with the remnants of overnight rain, and the trees leaned close, their leaves dripping, murmuring secrets in the heat. The wet season was waning, but its presence lingered in the swollen river and the slick stones beneath it. Tucked into the fringe lands just east of Kakadu, where the Arnhem Land escarpment loomed like a silent sentinel, the crossing felt both timeless and precarious, a threshold between the modern world and something far older. Kerry McLoughlin, a wiry man in his early 40s with sun-leathered skin and a crooked grin, pulled his battered ute to a stop near the crossing. The vehicle's tray rattled with fishing gear, a cooler of beer, and the quiet optimism of a ritual father and son shared. This was their escape, a sacred routine carved out of weekends away from the grind of the uranium mines where Kerry had worked since his 20s. The mines were loud, drills whining, machinery groaning, men shouting over the din. But here the silence was a balm, broken only by the hum of cicadas and the occasional plop of a fish breaking the surface. Kerry killed the engine and stepped out, inhaling deeply. The air carried the sharp tang of eucalyptus, the damp musk of river mud, and a faint briny undercurrent that hinted at the estuary's reach. He rolled his shoulders, savoring the stillness, the way the world seemed to pause here, as if waiting for permission to move. His boots crunched on the gravel as he surveyed the crossing, his eyes tracing the concrete's gentle dip into the water and its rise on the far bank. To an outsider, it looked benign, almost inviting, but Kerry knew better. He'd grown up in the territory, learned to read rivers the way his father had read cattle tracks. The East Alligator was no mere waterway. It was a living thing, with moods and memories. Tom, his 17-year-old son, climbed out of the passenger seat, his lanky frame a younger echo of Kerry's, but lacking his father's easy confidence. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and he pushed it back with a nervous gesture. Tom was quieter than Kerry, more cautious, his gaze darting to the water as if expecting it to confess its secrets. He'd been coming here since he was a boy, but the river still unnerved him. There was something about its stillness that felt wrong, like a held breath before a scream. "Doesn't feel right," Tom muttered, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the morning. Kerry chuckled, locking the ute's door with a lazy twist of his wrist. "It never does before the tide changes, mate. That's when the fish wake up. Look at that water. Perfect." And it was. The river lay like a polished mirror, its surface unbroken except for the occasional ripple of an insect or the dart of a mullet. The tide was low, the crossing barely submerged, but Kerry knew the water would rise soon, driven by the moon's pull and the estuary's pulse. For now, though, it was theirs. They walked to the edge of the crossing, rods in hand, boots scuffing old tire tracks embedded in the gravel. Kerry cracked open a beer from the cooler, the hiss of the can loud in the quiet. He handed one to Tom, who hesitated, his fingers brushing the cold aluminum before accepting it. Kerry grinned, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's reluctant step toward manhood. They cast their lines into the water, the lures arcing gracefully before sinking with soft plops. The river swallowed them without comment. They stood side by side, reels humming faintly as they worked the lines, waiting for a tug that didn't come. But it wasn't about the fish. Not really. It was about this. The river, the silence, the shared space where words weren't always needed. Kerry glanced at Tom, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to the water. He wanted to say something reassuring, but the moment felt too fragile, too perfect to break. Downstream, a family of 4 posed for photos near a rented camper van, their laughter carrying across the water. A handful of tourists gathered on the far bank, armed with cameras and long lenses, their voices a low murmur against the jungle's hum. Among them, Everett Galbraith, a retired accountant from Seattle, adjusted his tripod with the meticulous care of someone who trusted gadgets more than instinct. His khaki vest was stuffed with lenses and filters, and his face was flushed from the heat. He'd come to Kakadu chasing images of the wild, Brolgas dancing, Jabiros waiting, perhaps a crocodile if he was lucky. His lens swept the crossing, settling on Kerry and Tom, 2 figures framed against the river's sheen, a perfect shot of human and nature in harmony. He began clicking, delighted by the composition. Then something shifted. Kerry slipped. It was subtle at first, a slight stagger as his boot caught a slick stone beneath the water. He pitched forward, the river swallowing him up to his chest in an instant. A small gasp rose from the tourists on the far bank, their cameras swiveling toward the commotion. Everett's fingers froze on his shutter, his breath catching as he squinted through the viewfinder. The water around Kerry churned briefly, then stilled, but something else moved. Downstream, just below the surface, a long, sinuous shape glided with terrible grace. It wasn't driftwood. It wasn't a shadow. It was Eric. The name was legendary in these parts, whispered in pubs and around campfires. Eric was no ordinary crocodile. A saltwater male, ancient and battle-scarred, he was said to measure over 14 feet, his hide a map of old wounds and jagged scales. Locals spoke of him with a mix of awe and dread, claiming he haunted this stretch of the river, trailing boats, lurking beneath crossings, watching with yellow eyes that seemed to hold memory. Some said he chose his moments with a predator's cunning. Others swore he remembered faces, grudges, slights. The Beninj elders called him something else, a name not shared with outsiders, a spirit of the river that demanded respect. "My God!" Everett shouted, his voice cracking across the water like a whip. "You've got a croc moving down there!" Kerry looked up, frowning against the sun's glare, his beer still clutched in one hand. He couldn't make out Everett's words at first, the distance and the river's hum muffling them. Everett waved frantically, pointing downstream, his tripod wobbling. "There's a crocodile, it's coming toward you!" Kerry turned to the river, his movements unhurried. He'd heard the stories of Eric, told over beers at the Jabiru pub or in the quiet of a ranger's yarn. An old brute with a jagged back and eyes like polished stones. Some claimed he'd been seen trailing fishermen, studying them. Kerry believed in Eric, not as a monster, but as a force, a part of the river's ancient rhythm. He also believed he knew how to outsmart him. He'd crossed this river countless times, read its currents, timed its tides. He was no tourist, no fool. Chest deep now, Kerry moved with deliberate steps, the riverbed slick and uneven beneath his boots. He called to a stalled vehicle on the far bank, waving his beer can in warning. "Don't cross yet, mate. Tide's coming." Satisfied, he turned back toward Tom, who stood rigid on the bank, his rod forgotten in his hands. The water lapped at Kerry's ribs, cold despite the heat. Tom watched, his breath shallow, his eyes locked on his father. The river watched too, its surface betraying nothing. Below, a trail moved. Not fast, not frantic, but sure. It slipped through the shadows like a whispered promise, the ridge of a scaly head breaking the surface for a heartbeat. Yellow eyes, cold and unreadable, catching the light. Then it was gone, swallowed by the river's lie. Kerry took another step, his fishing rod swinging loosely in his grip. From the far bank, Everett screamed again, this time a name he'd overheard from the tourists. "Kerry!" Tom's voice joined, sharp and raw. "Dad!" Kerry froze. The ripple had sharpened into a wake, cutting through the water with purpose. For a moment the world went silent. The cicadas, the tourists, the river itself holding its breath. Then the water exploded. Eric lunged. There was a flash of teeth, the sickening sound of bones snapping. One moment Kerry stood waist-deep, swinging wildly. The next, he was gone. The crocodile clamped down on his skull with horrific precision. The jaws crushed through flesh and bone in a single devastating motion. Kerry's head separated from his body cleanly. His torso remained upright for half a second, then collapsed forward, arms floating lifelessly. Screams echoed across the river. Tom dropped to his knees on the bank, sobbing, eyes wide and unbelieving. He hurled another rock, and another, but they fell short. The water rolled gently, unhurried, as if it had not just witnessed a death. Eric turned, massive jaw still clamped on the lifeless corpse, and began gliding downstream. The crocodile didn't thrash or spin. He simply carried his prize, slow and methodical. His tail carved an elegant ripple through the muddy water, the way a boat might trace a line across a bay at sunset. Within 10 minutes, the emergency call was made. A search boat arrived, its hull slicing through the river foam. Dan Gillespie, a grim-faced man from Parks and Wildlife, stood at the bow with binoculars pressed to his face. His voice low and steady carried into the radio as he dished out commands. A helicopter roared overhead. A ranger manned the long rifle at the bow, scanning the water's surface. It didn't take long before they got a visual. Floating still, just off the middle channel, was a monstrous shape. Long, scarred, silent. In its jaws, the limp, headless form of Kerry McLoughlin. The ranger steadied the rifle. His hands didn't tremble. He waited for the perfect moment and then pulled the trigger. The crack echoed across the water like lightning splitting a tree. Blood misted into the air. The crocodile's skull jolted sideways. Kerry's body fell loose, slipping below the surface with barely a ripple. Eric did not flail. He turned, slowly, almost regally, and sank. There was no sign of struggle, just silence. The crocodile vanished into the deep like smoke through fingers. Is he dead? There's no way to know, as they don't always float. Kerry's body was recovered within minutes. The rangers lifted him from the water with quiet reverence. His limbs hung like soaked rope, skin grayed by the current. The body bag was unzipped just long enough for confirmation. Tom sat on the bank, unmoving. Only when his father's body was brought ashore did he rise, slowly, like someone walking underwater. He knelt beside the bag. He didn't cry. His face was drained of color, his eyes hollow. Night fell slowly over the camp. The air thickened with silence. The other tourists sat in a hushed circle, their camera bags untouched. Everett sat with his head bowed, holding the camera that had captured the last moments. Later, under the faint glow of a flashlight, he entered the portable darkroom in the back of their vehicle and developed the film. Frame by frame, the morning returned. Kerry smiling beside his son, rod in hand. A ripple in the background. A dark smudge breaching the surface. The father turning, eyes wide, not with panic, but something like recognition. The final frame burned in Everett's memory. He didn't print it. Instead, he fed it into a match flame. The photo curled, blackened, and then vanished. Days passed. Media came and went with pictures of the river, of warning signs, of tourists squinting into the sunlight with cameras. They said it was a mistake, an unfortunate accident, a reminder. But in Gumbalanya and the outposts along the riverbanks, people told the story differently. They didn't talk about alcohol, or slippery footing, or regulations ignored. They spoke of the crocodile, Eric. They said he had returned to the water with what he came for. And then he waited. A few weeks later, another man tried the crossing. A local this time, someone who'd done it 100 times before. The tide was low. The water only came up to his thighs. He waved at friends on the bank and took one step after another into the current. He never reached the other side. Rangers found only a blood trail on the stones and a single flip-flop wedged in the reeds. Dan Gillespie, standing at the edge of the water that afternoon, shook his head. They never learn. Cahill's Crossing remains popular. Tourists still arrive in droves, snapping photos of crocodiles sunning on the banks, daring each other to stand closer to the water for a better angle. Anglers still wade out waist-deep with coolers and rods, confident in their instincts, but locals still speak in low voices around campfires. They say Eric was never seen again, but that he's still there. Somewhere in the murky folds of the East Alligator River, he waits, not just hungry, listening, because the river remembers, and so do those who've watched it take.